Welcome to Cape Hatteras Lighthouse on the Outer Banks of North Carolina. Officially opened in 1870, Cape Hatteras Lighthouse is the 20th tallest lighthouse in the world at 208 feet tall, and it takes 450 gallons of paint to paint the black and white candy stripe pattern that makes it one of the most famous and most beautiful lighthouses across the world. Located 40 miles south of Oregon Inlet, Cape Hatteras Lighthouse stands on the 42-mile-long Hatteras Island, which divides the Atlantic Ocean and the Pamlico Sound, forming the famous bend where the barrier islands continue south and reconnect with the mainland. This bend forms a tip called Cape Point, which sticks out into the ocean like an elbow. This location was the perfect place to put a lighthouse. You can see this round well at the bottom, which has protection surrounding it to protect it from visitors. It used to be a 4-foot deep sand pit that was there in case the weight cable of the clockwork mechanism came apart, causing the weight to free fall to the bottom of the tower, and it would fall onto the sand, which is much more forgiving than the slate and marble floor. It was also a place to just set the weight during maintenance. Cape Hatteras helps to protect mariners from a stretch of treacherous barrier islands widely known as the Graveyard of the Atlantic. Cape Hatteras more specifically protects mariners from probably the most hazardous section of the coastline called Diamond Shoals. This is an area where the north-flowing Gulf Stream collides with the south-flowing Virginia Drift. These are very powerful currents that have been helpful over the centuries in shipping, but the colliding currents force southbound ships into a 12-mile-long sandbar about 15 to 20 miles offshore known as Diamond Shoals, which is responsible for hundreds and more likely thousands of shipwrecks. This area is most responsible for the nickname Graveyard of the Atlantic. The shoals had their own lighthouses offshore, which we may discuss another time. As we climb the lighthouse, you will see the vertical rails which extend to the top of the lighthouse in the center of the spiral staircase. These rails were never on the original work plan. They were actually added to the structure much later, which is why they are not so gracefully designed as everything else is. Usually the weights would drop down the center from a vertical cable, which were guided by fair leads that controlled the descent. You can see this in other lighthouses in the area. But these rails were installed to keep the weights from swinging excessively as they dropped to the bottom of the tower. This seems like a complicated system to get 5 gallons of oil 150 feet up to the lantern room, but it is the most effective method, as a rope and pulley took more effort and was never allowed in any lighthouse in the United States. Well oil and kerosene was extremely valuable, and the lighthouse keeper was required to keep it in his possession because oil usage was closely monitored due to the value, and the keeper would be held accountable for the waste. So the oil had to be lifted to the top in the safest way imaginable. The alcove at the bottom, which had the brown box, this was a 350-gallon tank which was used to store the oil to light the lamp. Originally, it was stored in the alcoves in large round metal tanks made of brass or tin that were around 50 to 100 gallons each. Each one had a valve at the bottom where the keeper could drain the oil into the can. He would then carry the cans to the top of the tower. The 350-gallon tank was only meant to replace the numerous small tanks, so there was just one large tank. Along the Outer Banks, there had been a struggle for well over a century trying to protect ships, as well as the lighthouses themselves. Can you believe that this lighthouse is over 150 years old? As old as this tower is, it was not the first lighthouse in the area. It's actually the second lighthouse that was built on the island. The first lighthouse was 90 feet tall, built out of sandstone. It was authorized by Congress in 1794 when they realized the extreme danger posed to the Atlantic shipping of coming too close to the shoals or the shoreline. Construction began in 1799, 1 mile from the shoreline, and it was completed and lit with a well-oiled lamp on October of 1803. In the 1800s, sailors found sailing along the coast as a simple, reliable form of navigation which kept them close to the shore in case there was trouble. Using the currents from the Virginia Drift and the Gulf Stream made life that much easier to move north and south. But after a number of issues, it was obvious this lighthouse was too short and insignificant. The lamp was too weak, and the sandstone color blended in with the background, rendering it ineffective in alerting ships that were coming too close to the deadly Diamond Shoals. After 18 years, the fifth auditor of the Department of the Treasury took over the lighthouse, and their first upgrade came in 1839, with an upgrade to hold 18 14-inch reflectors that of course scattered 14 beams of light. After 10 years without success in preventing wrecks, the light was once again upgraded to 15 21-inch reflectors. This made the light much stronger. It still ran off of well oil for fuel, and in perfect operating condition would produce a medium-intensity light that could be seen up to 20 miles away. This was still not enough. A quote from U.S. Navy Lieutenant David Porter in July 1851 said, "Hatteras Light, the most important on our coast, is, without doubt, the worst light in the world," along with a few more choice words, like the light was dimmer than any other ship lights. His ultimate suggestion was to place the light 15 feet higher than it was at the time. The Department of the Treasury established the Us Lighthouse Board shortly after that, which would take control of Cape Hatteras Lighthouse from 1852 to 1903. They needed a unified system of navigation aids along the coast so mariners could distinguish the shoreline. This was much different than before, where lighthouse construction generally rested with local authorities, which produced an ineffective national system that was not uniform. The board studied the decades of complaints and additional needs, and instead of 15 feet, they added an additional 60 feet to the height, which made it 150 feet tall. They painted the bottom half bright red so it would stand out during the day. They finished building the additions by 1853, and in 1854, money was appropriated for a first-order Fresnel lens with flashing white light to replace the old reflecting system. This was the strongest beam available in the world for a lighthouse. Over the following 6 or 7 years, the amount of shipwrecks steadily decreased. At this point, it seemed as if the upgrades were well worth the time and money to the shipping industry and the economy. Until 1861, when the Civil War brought the Union Army to the area to attack Confederate Army fortresses. The Confederates did not want the Union troops to use the lighthouse as a lookout post, so they attempted to destroy the tower like they destroyed Bodie Lighthouse. The Union forces prevented them from destroying it, but the Confederates did manage to take the Fresnel lens with them. Later, these lenses would be found in the rotunda of the North Carolina Capitol building. The Lighthouse Board replaced the light, but extensive repairs were needed after a number of strong storms, and studies showed it would be less costly to replace the tower with a new tower. So in 1868, Congress was ordered to appropriate $80,000 to the Lighthouse Board to build a new tower at Cape Hatteras. As soon as funding was received, construction began in 1868, headed by Brigadier General J.H. Simpson and project foreman Dexter Stetson, who was later in charge of building Bodie Lighthouse. He helped with Cape Lookout Lighthouse, and later became a prominent lighthouse builder on the West Coast. Stetson hired and trained 100 laborers locally at a rate of $1.50 per day, and had the help of the Army Corps of Engineers. Stetson had designed a floating foundation for the lighthouse. Workers began digging a pit for it, but around 4 feet down they hit the water table, and the pit began filling with fresh water. The pile driver had not been invented yet, so they could not drive piles into the hard sand. So since the water was not salt water, they layered 6-inch by 12-inch by 12-foot long yellow pine timbers crossways in the pit, then placed granite rock layers on top of the timbers and cemented them together. On top, an octagon-shaped brick and granite base supporting the structure that is over 21 feet tall and almost 38 feet across. The lighthouse itself is a conical brick tower with 20-inch interior walls that are a true cylinder, then 46 3/4-inch exterior walls that are tapered from bottom to top. The two walls join together at 134 feet and 4 inches, which is at the top of the 6th landing window. There are 12 full-length vertical walls that run from top to bottom between the interior and exterior walls that resemble the spokes of a wheel, giving the tower its rigidity, and the tower was topped off with an iron and glass lantern. The lighthouse would take around 1,250,000 bricks that were ordered from a Baltimore contractor. They were manufactured at a kiln on the James River in Virginia. The exact number used is unknown, but the number is fairly accurate. The lighthouse weighs in an estimated 4,830 tons. That's 9,660,000 pounds. Black slate and white marble tiles were installed from unknown quarries which are still used as the floors today. The building was completed in just under 2 years at a final cost of $167,500. The Fresnel lens was transferred from the 1803 lighthouse to the new tower, and it was first lit with kerosene on December 1, 1870. The light could reach 16 miles. The lightkeeper had to manually rewind the clockwork apparatus each day, which usually took 12 hours for a complete cycle. If you notice, the lamp was lit with kerosene instead of whale oil. Around that time, the sperm whale was becoming scarce and overhunted, and the board was searching for an alternate fuel for the lamp. There is not a known record of exactly when the last whale oil was used, but it is still mentioned in 1871 instructions to lighthouse keepers, along with wild cabbage or rapeseed oil or even colza oil, but it was all too difficult to get as they were low-profit crops from U.S. farmers. There was a very short experiment at Cape Hatteras using porpoise oil or dolphin oil, but it was considered totally unacceptable. All were considered as replacements, but between lard oil and kerosene, they decided to use kerosene for Hatteras, which is otherwise known as mineral oil. As a side note, in case you are wondering, the tallest lighthouse in the world is Jeddah Lighthouse in Saudi Arabia at 436 feet tall. The tallest brick lighthouse in the world is in Poland at 213 feet. But Hatteras is the tallest traditional brick lighthouse in the world, and has held that title since the day it was completed with the light at 208 feet. When it was completed, Hatteras Lighthouse was placed 1,500 feet from the water, a little more than a quarter of a mile, and it will sit there safe and solid for 130 years. Originally, to provide the keepers with compensation, the Lighthouse Board provided housing, food, medicine, and a salary up to $800 per year. Other than all of the other logistical duties, each keeper was required to stand a 4-hour watch during the night. The times of these watches alternated daily from keeper to keeper and ranged from 8 p.m. to midnight, midnight to 4 a.m., and 4 a.m. to 8 a.m., and each shift had its own responsibilities. And these responsibilities were mostly simple upkeep to the lighthouse and the surrounding properties. After the new tower was constructed in 1871, the old tower was demolished, leaving only the foundation and the ruins, which lasted until it finally eroded away in a massive storm in 1980. Around 1873, Hatteras received its legendary white and black stripe pattern that it currently has. In the spring of 1879, the tower was struck by lightning. Cracks appeared in the masonry walls which had to be repaired, and they placed a metal rod to connect the ironwork of the tower with an iron disc that was buried in the ground. The cracks are now reliably attributed to thermal expansion of the structure. In the 1980s, studies of the cracks revealed movement with temperature variations. After that, it remained in operation unobstructed until 1903. The Lighthouse Board maintained control of the lighthouse until 1910 before they were dissolved and the lighthouse was handed over to the newly formed Bureau of Lighthouses, who would maintain control from 1910 to 1935. This bureau studied the lighthouse for 2 years until 1912 before it increased the candle power of the light from 27,000 up to 80,000 candle power. The next year they changed the lamps to incandescent oil vapor lamps that used pressurized kerosene. The lamps still used regular kerosene as late as 1927, but the pressurized kerosene lamp was used primarily until 1934. Ever since the tower was completed, the water was eating away at the shoreline, getting closer and closer to the lighthouse. This did not get treated seriously until 1919, when the low tide line was at 300 feet and the high tide line had advanced to about 120 feet from the base of the tower. It lost over 1,200 feet to Mother Nature in a matter of 50 years. In such a short period of time, many people who visited the lighthouse frequently would have noticed such a dramatic change. So a number of groups began developing new ideas to help protect the shoreline over the next 10 years. Beginning in the 1930s, the Coast Guard first installed walls that were perpendicular to shore called sheet pile groins to help protect the tower. By 1933, only 14 years later, the lighthouse was less than 100 feet from the shoreline. More groins were installed at this point. It had lost 1,100 feet of shoreline in 13 years. It only took 2 more years for the water to go the last 100 feet and reach the lighthouse in 1935. Nothing had been successful in slowing or diverting the advancing water. So in 1935, Hatteras was decommissioned and replaced by a beacon mounted on a 4-legged steel skeleton tower named Buxton Woods Tower, which was on top of a 166-foot tall sand dune about a mile northwest, much farther back from the sea. The light would stay at this location until around 1950. In the meantime, erosion threatened to topple Hatteras Lighthouse as waves washed against the base, so the Bureau of Lighthouses abandoned Cape Hatteras Tower in 1935 and placed it into the custody of the National Park Service as basically a lost cause. They did not want to give up on it, so in 1936, the Park Service enlisted the help of the Civilian Conservation Corps to build sand dunes along the outer banks to aid in erosion control. Fast forward 3 years to 1938, 2 brothers that were 17 and 13 years old, named Anderson and Stockton Midget, began the Manteo-Hatteras bus line with their brother Harold. This bus line transported visitors, delivered mail, and daily newspapers every day, rain or shine. Anything that the people needed delivered up and down the island relied on the bus line to get the job done. This bus line drove on the sandy beaches in the days before roads and bridges were built, oftentimes getting stuck and needing an extra push. 15 years later, the Midget brothers were instrumental in establishing the Cape Hatteras National Seashore, which was established on January 12, 1953. Little did they know it is now one of the top destinations for family vacations in the United States. By 1939, the brothers were bringing tons of visitors. The visitors which came to the island would bring money into the locals, slowly establishing it as a vacation destination. So in 1939, the Civilian Conservation Corps' guides began giving tours of Cape Hatteras Lighthouse, which still had water coming eerily close to the base of the tower. The Civilian Conservation Corps and Works Progress Administration built a series of wooden retaining walls which controlled the tides that were carrying away the beach. This worked for about 3 or 4 years when World War II became a threat to the shoreline. In 1942, when German U-boats began attacking ships just offshore, the Coast Guard resumed its control over the lighthouse and manned it as a lookout station until 1945. The Coast Guard still maintains the light to this day. Over the 3-year period from 1942 to 1945, sand had been deposited on the beach and the lighthouse was between 500 to 900 feet from the shoreline. This made it possible as a place to maintain a lighthouse again. In 1946, the Fresnel lens was found to have been vandalized, so the Bureau placed inside a new 36-inch aviation rotating beacon with 250,000 candle power, which was visible for 20 miles. The same distance as before, but a much more intense light that flashed every 7.5 seconds. The Coast Guard placed the tower back in commission on January 23, 1950. The Coast Guard retained the Buxton Woods Tower in case the light ever had to be moved again. During 1950 to 1951, NC Highway 12 was built, and a ferry service was added at Oregon Inlet so visitors could more easily come to Hatteras. Shortly after this, in 1953, Cape Hatteras National Seashore was established, and the lighthouse was officially open to the public. This brought increasing amounts of visitors who were now able to more comfortably and quickly access the area. Around this time is when the shoreline began to slowly erode again, so in 1960 sand was pumped along the shorelines to artificially increase the distance of the lighthouse from the waves. This effort to stabilize the beach continued until the 1980s. In November 1963, at a cost of $4 million, the Herbert C. Bonner Bridge was completed, connecting Hatteras Island to the northern Outer Banks. This eliminated the need for the Ocracoke Inlet Ferry and allowed visitors to access the island even easier. In 1970, the lighthouse was once again 120 feet from the ocean's edge. 2 years later, in 1972, an 800,000 candle power rotary beacon was installed, consisting of two 1,000-watt lamps less than 10 inches tall, made by General Electric, filled with halogen, argon, and a tungsten filament at a cost of about $240 each. It can be seen up to 28 miles and flashes every 7.5 seconds. This is the light that is still used today. Even with most ships using modern GPS navigation, the light provides confirmation of modern navigational methods and a landmark for local boat traffic. In 1975, the lighthouse foundation was unsteady, and there were structural cracks in the tower which led to its closing to the public. By 1980, it was only 50 feet from the shoreline. That March, a severe winter storm caused significant dune erosion and swept away the foundation remains of the 1803 lighthouse, which was originally built 1 mile from the shoreline. So the shore had eroded a whole mile over the course of 175 years. Erosion of the beach at this point was being focused on as a never-ending threat. The parks and agencies could not battle the elements forever. So in 1980, the National Park Service began planning for long-term protection. A 3-year process produced several alternatives. Relocation was considered, but was quickly considered impractical. The option finally selected was a concrete and steel seawall that would have protected the lighthouse in place, but would eventually have created an island as the coastline kept receding. As technology advanced during the decade and additional information became available about relocation versus the approved seawall, the National Park Service examined the alternative that allowed it to accommodate natural processes while still preserving the historic lighthouse and its structures. In 1981, the Save the Lighthouse Committee was formed by U.S. Senator Helms and Governor Hunt of North Carolina, along with others. Experimental seagrass was placed along the shoreline to extensively help the sand from eroding. The lighthouse was also approaching the need for restoration. In 1984, after a 40-pound chunk of metal window trim fell to the ground, the lighthouse was forced to close to the public to prevent potential injuries. It would stay closed until 1993. In 1987, the National Park Service requested independent studies to save the lighthouse by the National Academy of Sciences. After a year, the report considered 10 options, but relocation was the most cost-effective. From 1988 to 1995, the relocation option was hotly debated and discussed because many people feared destruction of the lighthouse, but no funding requests were made at the congressional level or any private fundraising campaigns. By 1989, the National Park Service decided that leaving the lighthouse posed more risk than moving it. So in 1990, the restoration of the lighthouse began and was completed in 1993. Exterior painting was finished in 1994. As federal budgets became leaner, the National Park Service worked with the Army Corps of Engineers on a 10 to 20-year short-term protection option to build a fourth retaining wall south of the lighthouse. Officials hoped that it would protect the most vulnerable section of the lighthouse area and would give them time to secure funding for relocation. However, the North Carolina Coastal Resources Commission stated it would not recommend a permit for building the fourth groin since placing any hardened structures on the North Carolina coast is prohibited by state regulations. In 1996, NC State University independently reviewed the National Academy of Sciences report and then issued its own report by January 1997, supporting the previous findings but recommended that the National Park Service proceed as soon as possible with its present plans to obtain the financial resources necessary to preserve the lighthouse by moving it. National Park Service managers then initiated a concerted effort to begin the planning and funding process to move the Cape Hatteras Lighthouse. Funding was finally appropriated by Congress beginning in fiscal year 1998. The lighthouse had endured a lot over the course of its existence. Nobody knows how many storms Hatteras Lighthouse has survived, but it is obvious it survived all of them. Over 40 hurricanes, countless nor'easters, it even survived the Charleston earthquakes of August and September of 1886, which had 3 shocks up to 7.7 on the Richter scale that were felt in Chicago. Even when it was built, storm-driven tides easily washed over the island, which washed sand from the ocean side of the island and deposited on the sound side. This had been happening for over 10,000 years as the island slowly moved westward. The key to the tower surviving as long as it has was the floating foundation. As long as the sand surrounding the foundation remained in place and the timbers remained in the fresh water from the water table where they had been placed in 1868, the foundation would remain solid and secure. If a storm eroded the sand, or if salt water intruded on the fresh water, the timbers would rot and the foundation would fail. The decision was finally made to relocate the Cape Hatteras Light Station when it was once again only 15 feet from the base of the lighthouse. The move was controversial at the time, with speculation that the lighthouse would not survive the move, which resulted in lawsuits which were later dismissed with no supporting evidence. The principal keeper's quarters, double keeper's quarters, oil house, cisterns, and sidewalks had already been moved during February, March, and April, and the lighthouse was all that remained. In theory, moving the lighthouse consisted of lifting it off its foundation, transferring the load to a transport system, moving the tower along a prepared move route, and installing it on the new foundation. To accomplish this, the original foundation was replaced by temporary beams and supports, which were systematically replaced by main beams, supports, and hydraulic jacks to raise the entire lighthouse 6 feet, and then install a system of rollers. That's the easiest way to explain it without getting too complicated. The workers would then move the tower along to its new location, 2,900 feet to the southwest, starting on June 17, 1999. Push jacks allowed the frame supporting the lighthouse to move forward 5 feet at a time, and a system of 60 automated sensors monitored the load, tilt, vibration, and shaft diameters. At the top, a weather station was installed to monitor temperatures and wind speed. This was a detailed project accomplished by a lot of well-educated people, and the project went off without a hitch. On July 9, 1999, the lighthouse was carefully placed onto its new foundation, 1,500 feet from the shoreline. The new foundation consisted of a 60-foot by 60-foot steel-reinforced concrete slab, 4 feet deep, with 5 feet of brick and 2 feet of rock. The light station was whole once again, with all the buildings being in the same relative position as they were originally. This would officially be the tallest brick structure ever moved in history, and everything was moved in only 23 days at a final cost of $11.8 million. The lighthouse resumed operation on November 13, 1999, once again becoming the sentinel of the perilous Diamond Shoals, and should not be threatened by erosion for another 100 years, when it may have to be moved again, but the water has a barrier of sand dunes and a forest to get through first. In 2000, the lighthouse was reopened to the public for climbing. On June 11, 2001, the lighthouse closed to the public again as the stairs needed repairs. In December 2002, the lighthouse received a fresh coat of paint. On April 18, 2003, the lighthouse reopened to the public 2 years after closing. In 2006, the pedestal and clockwork were removed from the tower and reunited with the lens at the graveyard of the Atlantic Museum. In 2014, the lighthouse received its next coat of paint during the spring and summer months. Of course, there is a fee to climb the lighthouse, like all of the lighthouses along the Outer Banks. If you consider the amount in repairs, paint, mowing the grass constantly, and the money to pay the rangers to manage the property, a small fee is worth it to support history. During the climb, if you looked at the walls along the stairs, you can easily see discoloration from the amount of people that climb the tower each year and touch the walls. This is from dirt, oils, and paint wearing off of the wall. Your ticket fee covers this type of repairs as well as natural repairs. It is currently the middle of the year 2020, and in 2021 there is anticipation for more restoration work. The project is said to include repairs to masonry, metal components, windows, marble flooring, and the lantern itself. It will also be receiving its next coating of paint. The funds have already been approved, but the details are still being discussed, so you should try to visit the lighthouse as soon as possible, as it may be closed for a few years. And thanks to this hard work and determination of a lot of people, the lighthouse still exists today and is no longer threatened as it once was before. Hatteras Island has a population of only 4,000 people, and you can't say that they're all on the island full time, but the island still receives an average of 205,000 visitors each month. Only a small portion of those end up climbing the lighthouse. Most of the visitors come for the beauty of the Outer Banks and the fishing. The largest portion of the Gulf Stream comes the closest to the east coast along the Outer Banks. This provides world-class marlin fishing, and gives Hatteras its nickname as Blue Marlin Capital of the World. Overall, with Hatteras Lighthouse as a centerpiece, Hatteras Island is a wonderful place to visit along the East Coast, and the Outer Banks are a must-see vacation at least once in everyone's lives. Thanks for watching my video. I hope I managed to teach you something new. If you enjoyed it, hit the like button and subscribe to my channel. I'll be making more of these in the future for everybody to enjoy. And that's it for this video, and have a good one.